In the quiet outskirts of a Texas town, Daniel, a 28-year-old mechanic, spent most of his life in the shadow of grease and engines. His garage was modest, nothing more than a wide shed with rusty tools and the smell of gasoline clinging to the air. Yet for all its simplicity, the garage was his sanctuary. Daniel worked long hours, often forgetting to eat, losing himself in repairing engines and welding broken parts. Though his hands were rough and stained with oil, his heart carried an unspoken longing, dreams of doing something more meaningful than fixing worn-out cars. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, a sleek black limousine rolled up to his small shop. Its glossy finish looked strangely out of place among the dusty trucks and beat-up sedans scattered around the garage lot. Passers-by slowed down, staring in surprise, while Daniel wiped his hands on an old rag, curiosity flickering in his eyes. The car door opened, and out stepped Victoria Hayes, a woman in her late 40s. Known across the state as a billionaire business magnate, she carried herself with elegance, but her face wore desperation instead of pride. Daniel raised an eyebrow, puzzled by her presence. "Ma'am, I don't usually work on luxury vehicles." "Like that," he said, assuming she wanted a repair, but Victoria shook her head, her voice trembling as she explained that it wasn't the car that had brought her to him. From the limousine's back seat, an assistant carefully wheeled out her daughter Isabella, an 18-year-old girl with a delicate frame and hauntingly sad eyes. Paralyzed from the waist down after a terrible accident, she had been told by countless doctors that she would never walk again. Victoria's words came quickly, almost pleading. She told Daniel she had heard whispers about him, stories that he wasn't just an ordinary mechanic. Rumors claimed he once designed a prototype exoskeleton suit, a project born from love and desperation when his late brother lost mobility years ago. Daniel stiffened at the mention of his past, shaking his head firmly. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a miracle worker." But then Isabella looked at him, her soft gaze carrying both sadness and hope, and for a fleeting second, Daniel felt his resistance falter. After a long silence, he exhaled deeply and finally agreed to try. The decision weighed heavily on him, but something about Isabella's quiet courage gave him strength. Over the following weeks, his garage transformed from a place of simple repairs into a workshop of invention. Old engines were pushed aside to make room for circuits, servos, and sensors. Late into the night, sparks flew as Daniel welded scraps into usable parts, reprogrammed outdated chips, and tested mechanisms with tireless determination. Every small success filled the air with cautious optimism, though every failure reminded him of the risks he carried. Isabella became a regular visitor, rolling into the garage with curious eyes and cautious excitement. She often sat close watching Daniel's hands move with precision as he explained how each wire connected or how every servo motor responded. Slowly, she began to participate, offering him tools, tightening bolts, and asking thoughtful questions. Though fear sometimes crept into her heart, Daniel's steady patience and quiet encouragement built her confidence. What grew between them wasn't based on wealth or obligation, but on trust, laughter, and shared moments of perseverance. Finally, after weeks of relentless work, the suit was ready. It was a rough prototype, nothing polished, but it carried the essence of Daniel's vision and the hope Isabella so desperately clung to. The day she stood inside the suit for the first time, the air in the garage grew heavy with anticipation. Daniel knelt to secure the braces around her legs, his hands trembling despite his calm expression. Victoria clutched her chest, unable to breathe as she watched her daughter prepare for something doctors had deemed impossible. Isabella closed her eyes and whispered, "Please, let this work." The moment the suit whirred to life, the air in the garage felt charged, like the world itself had paused to watch. Isabella's legs trembled under the guidance of Daniel's invention, the motors humming softly as they aligned with her movements. Her first step was hesitant, the weight of months in a wheelchair pressing against her resolve. But it was still a step. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as she turned to look at her mother. Victoria gasped, her hands covering her mouth as she whispered, almost in disbelief, "She's walking." With every attempt that followed, Isabella grew braver. At first, her steps were uneven, supported by Daniel's steady hand at her side. But within days, she found a rhythm, her body learning to trust the suit's mechanics. The once timid girl who rolled into the garage now stood tall, determination lighting her face. Neighbors gathered outside, sneaking glimpses of the miracle unfolding. Whispers turned into stories, and soon the town buzzed with news of the girl who walked again. For Isabella, every step wasn't just progress, it was a declaration of hope. As word spread, the garage became more than Daniel's workspace. It became a place of wonder. Doctors arrived, eager to study the design, and engineers came with offers of partnerships. Some promised fortunes if he would sell the plans, while others saw only profit in his work. Daniel, however, stood firm, shaking his head at every proposal. "This isn't about money," he said firmly to Victoria one evening, wiping sweat and grease from his brow. "It's about giving people their lives back, not selling miracles to the highest bidder." Victoria listened, her heart swelling with both admiration and humility. She had spent her life surrounded by wealth, influence, and power, yet here was a humble mechanic who refused to be swayed by any of it. Deeply moved by his integrity, she made him a promise. She would fund his work, every tool, every resource, every connection, but only under one condition. Daniel had to remain in control of how the technology was shared. It would never be turned into something exclusive for the privileged few. Daniel agreed, knowing this was the only way to honor his brother's memory. Together, they formed a foundation dedicated to restoring mobility for children across the country. The first suits were built in Daniel's garage, then later in a proper workshop, funded by Victoria's resources. Each one was delivered free of charge to families who had long lost hope. Isabella became the face of the foundation, standing proudly on stage at events. Each time she walked across a platform, her story rippled through the crowd, inspiring parents, children, and strangers alike. Her voice carried strength as she told the world what Daniel's compassion had given her. Not just her legs, but her future. Though his name began appearing in headlines, Daniel never allowed fame to change him. Reporters described him as a small-town miracle worker, but he still woke up each morning and walked into his modest garage as if nothing had changed. He fixed cars with the same quiet dedication, his hands stained with oil, his heart steady. Yet every spark of his welder and every turn of his wrench felt different now. Each sound reminded him of the miracles his work had sparked beyond that little garage. Miracles that touched lives far beyond his reach. For Isabella and her mother, Daniel had become more than just a mechanic. To Victoria, he was the man who reminded her that wealth meant nothing without compassion. To Isabella, he was the one who gave her back her ability to stand, to dream, and to walk into a future she once thought was lost forever. In their lives, Daniel wasn't just the man who repaired broken machines. He was the one who repaired hope itself, proving that sometimes miracles come from the unlikeliest of places.